we can see about the reproductive isolation in detail. So, in the previous class, we have already mentioned that the reproductive isolation, it can be categorized into two: prezygotic or pre-mating and post-zygotic or post-mating reproductive isolating mechanisms. So, first we can see about the prezygotic or pre-mating isolation. So, as you already know, the prezygotic isolation, here the hybridization of the members of different population is prevented. So, the production of hybrid or zygote is also prevented. So, under this prezygotic or pre-mating isolation comes different types of reproductive isolation. And the first one we have to see is about the habitat isolation. So, habitat isolation is also called as ecological isolation or environmental isolation. So, here the mating is prevented or interbreeding is prevented because the organisms, they occupy different habitats though they reside in the same territory. So here the habitat is acting as a barrier to prevent the members from interbreeding. That is why this type of isolation is called as habitat isolation. It is also called as ecological isolation or environmental isolation. So, when we discuss about the examples, you may be having much more idea. So, one of the example is insects, which lives in a coniferous tree, cannot interbreed with insects living in the deciduous tree. So, certain insects which are preferring to reside in the coniferous trees, they may not be going to the deciduous tree even though they are residing in a common territory. Okay. So, in a forest there may be coniferous trees as well as deciduous trees, but if the insect prefer to live in a coniferous tree, they may not go in search of insects for mating in a deciduous tree. So, here even though they are residing in the same forest, this interbreeding is prevented between these two insects due to their habitat preference. Another example which can be considered is beetles. So, beetles, some of the beetles, they live underground. Okay. So, this group of beetles, which spend their lives burrowing below the ground, they are being isolated from the beetles spend their life on the trees. So, ground dwelling beetles may not be going up the tree for mating in search of mate. The tree dwelling beetles may not be going down in search of underground beetles. So, here the habitat is again acting as a barrier. So, this is another example of a flycatcher. So, there are 5 different types, and each of them they prefer some type of habitat. Some of the flycatchers they prefer the open woods. Some of them they prefer the deciduous forest, swampy woods. Some of them like bushy pastures. Some of them need coniferous woods, and some flycatchers they are seen in the alder trees. So, since they are preferring different types of habitat, The flycatcher which occupy one type of habitat cannot be going in search of a mate in another type of habitat. So here also the habitat preference is acting as a barrier. Another example is that of Rana grillo, pig, which is called as a pig frog, and the Rana areolata, this is called as a gopher frog. So this Rana grillo, it is uh, extremely aquatic. They dwell in deep ponds, lakes, and marshes. So in the case of this Rana areolata, they live in burrows during the daytime, but active at the night. And they are seeing around the margins of the swamp only. So the pig frogs, they breed in deep water. So it has no preference for the gopher frog that lives on the shallow waters of the grassy pond. So here also the preference of the habitat, it eliminates the possibility that these two species, they will come together and breed, because the preference of both these frogs are entirely different. The pig frog, they like the deep water, and the gopher frog, they prefer the swampy, shallow ridge, the sides of the pond. So here the ecological isolation, it give importance to the point that the separation is brought about by the differences in the environmental factors. It may be the preference about the food or the habits or certain other physical requirements. So ecological isolation as such, it may not be effective in preventing the interbreeding that has the ability to freely move, or which has the ability to travel long distances, but to certain smaller organisms which does not possess the ability for a long migration. For such animals, this habitat may be acting as a barrier. So such type of reproductive isolation, which is caused mainly due to the preference of the habitat of certain organisms, it is called as a habitat isolation, ecological isolation, or environmental isolation. Now we move on to the second type of isolation, that is called as a seasonal reproductive isolation, or it is also called as a temporal isolation. So here the reproductive isolation or interbreeding between the members is prevented due to the reason that the members, they reach the sexual maturity at different seasons of the year. So the breeding season of two species, they will never coincide. They are occupying the same geographical area, but their breeding season is not coinciding, so there is no possibility to interbreed. So such type of isolation is called as seasonal isolation or temporal isolation. So here also we have so many examples. This three species of frogs are there. Rana clamitans, Rana pipiens, Rana sylvatica. Okay, 3 species are there. Rana pipiens, Rana sylvatica, and Rana clamitans. So these 3 species, they reside in the same pond, but they are having different breeding seasons. So there is no chance of interbreeding between the members of this species. So Rana sylvatica, it will begin the breeding before others. Okay. So it will be usually the breeding season is the late of March or early April. So it all depend upon the temperature of the water. Now, so that is a case of Rana sylvatica. Then Rana clamitans, they may not be beginning the breeding until others complete their breeding. So here again the water temperature is a major factor. So Rana clamitans, they breed only when the temperature of the water exceeds 60 degree Fahrenheit. The Rana pipiens, it prefers a temperature of 55 degrees Celsius. That means their breeding period is around the mid-April. So the breeding period, it depends upon the temperature or the seasonal fluctuation in the temperature. It induces the breeding in the frog. So here different species, since they are preferring different temperatures, there is no chance for them to interbreed. Another example is that of salamanders, Amblystoma tigrinum and Amblystoma maculatum. 2 different species of salamanders. They are occupying the same area, but the interbreeding is prevented because the Amblystoma tigrinum, it completes the breeding before the end of March. But Amblystoma maculatum, it does not start their breeding until the beginning of April. So their breeding seasons are never coinciding, so there is no chance for interbreeding. A lot of examples are there. Another example is the case of Buffo, the common tots. Buffo americanus and Buffo oleri. There are 2 species, they cannot interbreed again because of the 2 different breeding seasons. There's spotted skunk, eastern spotted skunk and western spotted skunk. They're also not able to interbreed because of this temporal isolation, because the time period of breeding is different between these 2 species. So this is a case of the Buffo that we have mentioned. Then again cicadas. There are 3 different cicadas. They are having 3 different breeding seasons. So only in once in 221 years, these breeding season will overlap. Only then these cicadas will be able to interbreed. So until then, each of these 3 species will be having different breeding season and may not be able to interbreed. Okay, so this is a case of Rana that we have mentioned, Kang, and again